Unbelievable.
With Greenpeace unwilling to be interviewed, I had to find a different avenue for answers.
There's something really fishy going on over there.
Fortunately, I found a former Greenpeace board of director who now speaks openly about the industry.
Environmental organizations, like other organizations, are not telling you the truth about what the world needs from us as a species. It's so frustrating when the information is right before their eyes. It's documented in peer-reviewed papers and journals. It's there for everybody to see, but the environmental organizations are refusing to act. Nowhere do you find in their policies, and nowhere do you find in the Greenpeace mission that diet is important, that animal agriculture is the problem. They are refusing, like other environmental organizations, to look at the issue. The environmental community is failing us, and they're failing ecosystems. And it's so frustrating to see them do this.
NRDC, the Earth's best defense. All right, so here they actually do have a few things on animal agriculture.
The leading cause of environmental degradation is too much pollution and too many engines churning too fast in too many places around the globe.
Lately, in 2009, a World Watch reported that livestock causes 51% of greenhouse gas emissions, when transportation is around 13%, and then the low end, the UN, was around 18 to 30, which is more than all transportation, all put together.
Internationally or nationally? Yeah, I think energy production and transportation are still major sources. So I think I guess I'm not going to comment on that because I'm not familiar with those numbers. So it's don't quote me on this, but that's cow farts. That's what I think what that is. I think that's cow farts.
Well, that's part of the story. Methane production from cows and other livestock's flatulence is a major contributor, but mostly it is due to deforestation and the waste they produce, which is 130 times more waste than the entire human population, virtually all without the benefit of any waste treatment.
NRDC absolutely, as I said, has a big food program. In fact, we just, every year we do the Growing Green Awards, and we recognize food innovators. And this last year, one of the awardees was a sustainable pork producer, actually, that doesn't use any antibiotics, and also the antibiotic use that industrial food production in the United States uses right now. Is, we're giving the majority of antibiotics in the United States are administered to healthy livestock.
I wanted to visit one of these sustainable farms. I found the Markegard grass-fed beef farm on the lush, misty California coast. I met Eric and Donegal Markegard and their 4 children.
Leah and Larry are usually up at 6 and out, milking the cows, slopping the hogs. Altogether, we graze about 4,500 acres, and this is our home ranch, and this is 952 acres of that. On average, it's about 1 cow or cow and a calf per every 10 acres. We would produce annually roughly 80,000 pounds of finished plate-ready meat. We keep about 10 pigs in roughly a 50-acre area, and we move them around in 10-acre pastures.
some people think that pigs are dirty and gross, but I really like them. They know people, and they'll be friends and really nice. And it could be like your best friend, or it could be like your sister. See? They know you when you get to know them. I mean, I shouldn't be bonding, but you have to have a nice day.
Why shouldn't you bond with them?
Well, because they're going to turn into bacon.
Oh.
But
These pigs are about 7 months old now. So these bigger ones are getting ready to be killed. Those two smaller ones there, they could grow up a few more months. I love animals, and that's why I'm in the meat business.
It's what more of society needs to see, is that packaged piece of meat is a living animal, living and breathing creature that, it's hard. It's hard. But like what Donica said earlier, we do it because we love them.
With the land use, there's anywhere between, with industrial, as low as 2 to 2.5 acres per cow, all the way up to some, depending, it's not as lush as this, up to 35 acres.
Yeah, we have a ranch in South Dakota that's 50 acres.
50 acres per.
Yeah, it's about 50 acres, yeah.
And why is that?
Same thing, it was just farmed and robbed of all the nitrogen, the land
also
was abused,
seasonal,
and
right?
It's also seasonal.
Is it possible, and is it practical for the whole world to, say, have grass-fed cattle? In, like, say, Brazil, where, 80% of the rainforest was destroyed for cattle. What are your thoughts on that?
They shouldn't be eating beef. If their environment wasn't designed to raise beef, then they shouldn't be eating it.
Yeah.
How do you offset the carbon footprint of livestock?
We don't feel like livestock have a carbon footprint.
I left there feeling confused. And as far as grass-fed beef not having a carbon footprint, it actually sounded like it could make sense until I added up the numbers on land use and population. If we were to use the Markegard model of raising animals, which requires 4,500 acres producing 80,000 pounds of meat, the average American eats 209 pounds of meat per year. If that was all grass-fed beef, only 382 people could be fed on their land. That equates to 11.7 acres per person times 314 million Americans, which equals 3.7 billion acres of grazing land. Unfortunately, there are only 1.9 billion acres in the U.S.'s lower 48 states. Currently, nearly half of all United States land is already dedicated to animal agriculture. If we were to switch over to grass-fed beef, it would require clearing every square inch of the United States, up into Canada, all of Central America, and well into South America. And this is just to feed the United States' demand on meat. But that figure doesn't even take into consideration that much of that land isn't suited to graze livestock. We would have to convert all mountain ranges to grassland, clear ancient forests and national parks to grazing, and demolish every city just to make room to graze cows. Just like Brazil, the United States isn't suited to meet the demands for meat.
It takes 23 months for a grass-fed animal to grow to the size and age that it's slaughtered, whereas a grain-fed takes 15 months. So that's an additional 8 months of water use, land use, feed, waste. And in terms of a carbon footprint, it's a huge difference.
Turns out, due to land use, grass-fed beef is more unsustainable than even factory farming. I had to come to terms with the fact there was no way to sustainably raise enough animals to feed the world's current demand on meat, and had my doubts on dairy as well. But I did want to talk with a premier organic dairy company to see if they believe their product was sustainable for the world's population.
It requires a lot of inputs to produce milk. The feed, the water, the land, it does. And it may not be practical to expect that there can be enough dairy production produced in a sustainable way to feed the entire world. I just don't think that that's necessarily a given. I think it's maybe too much to expect that the world can be fed with dairy in a sustainable way. I don't know the answer, but common sense would say that's a long shot.
I was shocked to hear such an honest answer. If this is what the dairy's CEO would say, I wonder what the farmer would claim. Based on their marketing, it seemed their farms were an oasis for cows. It was not what I expected.
Typically, a cow will eat, 140 to 150 pounds of feed a day. 40 to 50 pounds of feed every day. And then she's also going to drink between 30 and 40 gallons of water. Probably go through about 20 tons per week. 20 tons of grain per week. Primarily for our milking cows, so about 250 cows. Yeah, so the biggest part of sustainability, to me, the number one thing on the list should be profitability. So how the process completely works from start to finish is the cow needs to have a baby in order to give milk. And so she'll have her baby. That baby's going to stay with the mother for at least 2 days. The babies will go off to our calf raising facility, so they have an individual hutch that they'll be raised in. Since we're a dairy, it's only the girl cows that give us milk. So the boys, on typical dairies, they're sold off to beef raising facilities. But we do keep approximately half, and we raise them for 2 years and sell them as organic grass-fed beef.
So all dairy cows eventually go to the beef industry?
Mm-hmm. At some point in time, she's really going to drop off, and so you have to make a business decision at that point. Are you going to keep investing in her, to give milk, or are you going to sell her off again to another dairy or into the beef industry? There's very few places on this planet that have this type of environment. But the demand on dairy-based protein in the world is only going to increase. And there's not enough land on the planet to do this type of dairying around the world. It's just the environment is not going to be that way. The land's not there.
So I guess on a global scale, the conclusion would be dairy is not sustainable.
Unless we start digging up houses and putting pastures back. The only way to start digging up houses and development is to have less people. But we only know that population is going to continue to grow. So that means more commercial dairying, I'm sure.
Either that or some low demand by the people.
Yeah, or some other product's going to take its place. I mean, we see there's all sorts of soy milks and almond milk and a lot of other products that are coming out in different blends. Where you take juices and proteins, and I think you'll see a lot more of that.
He was right. How could cow's milk be sustainable? For when 1 gallon of milk, it takes upwards of 1,000 gallons of water to produce. Doing research on grass-fed livestock, I kept coming across the work of Alan Savory. Almost a third of the planet's land is becoming desert, with a vast majority due to livestock grazing. Savory claims that the best way to reverse this desertification is to actually graze more animals. This reminded me of Oceana saying the best way to help fish is to eat fish. This is the same man during the 1950s working as a research officer for the game department of what is now Zimbabwe, came up with a theory in spite of scientific evidence that actually elephants were the cause of desertification there. And his solution was convincing the government to kill 40,000 elephants. Yet, after 14 years of relentless slaughter, the conditions only got worse. His theory was wrong. The culling finally ended, but not until tens of thousands of elephants and their families were killed. This is not someone I would ever take ecological advice from. It turns out the cattle industry is having the same effect on wildlife in the United States.
The government has been rounding up horses en masse, and we now have more wild horses and burros in government holding facilities, 50,000 wild horses and burros in government holding facilities than we have free on the range. Basically, you have ranchers who get to graze on our public lands for a fraction of the going rate. So they're getting like this huge tax subsidy. It's about 1/15 of the going rate. And what the Bureau of Land Management has to do is say how much forage and water is on the land. And then they divvy it up. They give so much to the cows, so much to, wildlife, and so much to the wild horses and burros. And what we see is the lion's share of the forage and water is going to the livestock industry. And then they scapegoat the horses and burros and say, oh, there are too many horses and burros, let's remove them. I always tell people that wild horses and burros are just one of the victims of the management of our public lands for livestock, because we also see the predator killing going on. We know wolves are now being targeted by ranchers to get rid of wolves. USDA has aircraft, and all they do is aerial gunning of predators. So all a rancher does is call up and say, I've got a coyote here. They'll come over and they'll shoot the coyote, or they'll shoot the mountain lion, or they'll shoot the bobcat. And this is all for ranching.
In Washington State, after cattle were found to be attacked on public lands where they were grazing under permit, Washington State decided to kill the entire wedge pack of wolves. And those wolves were not introduced. They had in-migrated from Canada, but they're no longer there.
It starts at the local level with the Bureau of Land Management, but then it goes all the way to Congress. And we see Congress, sitting there willing to allow this type of mismanagement of our public lands to continue.
It is the insistence of and the lobbying power of the animal agriculture industry that continues to see wolves killed, continues to see an insistence that predators be maintained at a low level that does not benefit ecosystems.
I've seen so many pieces of land, I've looked at so many environmental assessments from the Bureau of Land Management where they say the rangelands are not meeting standards. And they say straight up, livestock grazing is a cause for not meeting range standards, and yet they will continue to allow livestock grazing.
They're at the very core of making sure that cougars are treed by hounds and that wolf packs are run down and that hunting seasons are opened up year-round and that traps are set so that they can suffer.
If anyone cares about wild horses and wildlife and public lands and the environment, you can't ignore the livestock, the impact, the negative impact that livestock grazing is having on our public lands in the West.
I've added up the costs of animal food production that the producers don't actually bear themselves. These are the hidden costs or the externalized costs that they impose on society. And those are in categories like healthcare, environmental damage, subsidies, damage to fisheries, and even cruelty. If you take those externalized costs, which are about $414 billion, if the meat and dairy industries were required to internalize those costs, if they had to bear those costs themselves, the costs of the retail prices of meat and dairy would skyrocket. So a $5 carton of eggs would go to $13. A $4